We're talking Econ 101. Joining us because we are not economics experts. That's why we talk to the experts. Rick Reid is here, an economics instructor with the Fox Valley Technical College. Good morning, Rick. Thanks so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We wanted to talk about the downgrade, the U.S. downgraded by Moody's. All three major credit rating firms are no longer giving the United States their best rating. For those of us who have never taken economics and are just kind of peripherally aware of economics, what does this mean and why should we care?
We should all care. So probably the easiest thing to relate to is when you go to apply for a credit card or a loan, say to buy a car, the lender is going to run your credit report, and they run it through one of three credit rating agencies, and they collect data on you and they determine how likely it is you are to pay your bills on time. And based on that score, helps determine what your what your interest rate is likely to be and how likely lenders are to be able to lend money to you. In a very simplistic way, this is kind of a very parallel situation. Nations, when they go to lend money or go to borrow money, get rated. And the three dominant ones that we care about in the United States are Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and Moody's. Standard & Poor's downgraded us in, I think, I want to say about 2011. Fitch was just a couple of years ago, about 2023, and Moody's was the last one to come to the show. And basically, what it means is that the United States credit, in other words, when the United States sells bonds to be able to borrow money from anybody that's willing to lend it to us, we're slightly less perfect in terms of our ability to manage our debt and pay our bills.
Well, and that's what it comes down to, essentially, if I am hearing you correctly, Professor, that they are looking at the United States and how likely we are to be good for our debts, right?
Right. And actually, Moody's, in its commentary, offered a few comments. One of them is that the big knock on the rating resulted from our inability to manage our debt overall and come to agreement. And this has been something that's plagued both Republican and Democratic administrations and Congresses. So this isn't something that suddenly happened.
Right.
However, it did just suddenly happen.
Because of this latest downgrade by Moody's.
Right.
Right.
Rick, I have a question for you because I remember that push notification that came through my phone saying that Standards and Poor's had downgraded America's credit rating, and it sent shockwaves through the news. I mean, it was like, oh, okay, our economy is very bad, and granted, we were like downgraded, I think, one level, and it wasn't the end of the world, but it was still a huge thing, and it's hard to come back from. Did Standard & Poor's ever upgrade us? Did we get back to the perfect across the three, or have we been sitting at that credit rating with them since 2010, 2011?
I believe we're sitting with the same credit rating since 2010, 2011. Yeah.
So the question I would have, because I'm an individual who has for the past, oh, good Lord, time's a construct, say 15 years, I've been working on getting my credit better and better and better because for me as a person, it helps.
Yes.
How does that work for a country, though? What's the process? What's the process for, like, if America said, hey, we want to really get back on track and spend right and get that credit rate? Because if it hasn't changed since then, does it really matter then? Because as an individual basis, I feel like credit ratings are kind of a scam. I think it's a game. But how does the country on the whole
improve our credit score?
Yeah.
Right. Well, the big knock has been on our ability to manage our debt and our budgets. Moody's made commentary that it felt fairly confident that we were able to manage the value of the currency, which is really important, right? And that falls on the shoulders primarily of the Federal Reserve. they've done a great job of making sure that the value of the dollar has been relatively stable. But the thing that really has hurt us is the fact that we continue to run deficits and we don't seem to be able to get that under control. And as importantly, we don't seem to be able to set a clear path over time. So if you think about the current issues that are hitting us, the tariffs, all the issues around the tariffs has created a lot of uncertainty in the marketplace. Right. And the issues around what the administration is calling the big beautiful bill that has now been approved by the House of Representatives. That wasn't the thing that comes to my mind is that, remember the film from this is a long time ago, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles?
Sure.
And John Candy and Steve Martin are driving down the highway. They're trying to make time, and a driver is riding parallel to them and honking their horn and saying, "You're going the wrong way." And Candy and Steve Martin go, "Ha ha ha! How do they know where we're headed?" Right? Sure, buddy. Ha 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 ha! This is kind of the same thing. That was the first thing that came to my mind, was that Moody's is basically saying, "Folks, you got to get your act together." Congress and the administration are saying, "Okay, yeah, this is what we're going to do for our budget. We're going to have these tax cuts that we're going to reinforce. We're going to cut some spending in specific areas like Medicaid and SNAP." But at the end of the day, the Congressional Budget Office has basically said that bill is going to create another $3.8 trillion in debt over the next 10 years. That's the kind of thing that Moody's is pointing to and saying, you know what, you got enough debt. You've checked that box. It's time to reel it in a little bit.
There. Yeah,
and you need to start making some progress in that direction.
Oh my gosh, that is. I don't want to say that's it, but that's a really, for me, my brain, that's a really good comparison. And now as a way of thinking and talking about it, that's a really scary way of putting it, that they're basically saying, "Hey, here's how you do it." And we're like, "Cool, we're going to do it a different way. See you in a couple of years."
Well, and I guess, again, I go back to the IRS under President Biden, because they had hired so many more IRS agents who were going after the bigger tax cheats, which brought in over $1 billion when they were doing that. And now they've X'd that out. So we don't have that revenue coming in either. So it's kind of a rolling ball that doesn't seem to be stopping anywhere, does it?
Exactly. No, it doesn't. And it seems like it may be headed in the wrong direction.
Right.
One of the great challenges, though, is that we talked a little while ago about the U.S. bonds and
Yes.
the fact that the yield just went up on the U.S. bonds because they became less attractive, and that preceded Moody's downgrade. And there have been a number of factors, not the least of which is the fact that part of it had to do with China selling off a lot of their holdings of the U.S. Treasury bonds after they were threatened with a very steep tariff level.
Right.
And, you can interpret it however you want. The easy interpretation is that China was saying, "Okay, if you're going to charge us with tariffs, take this." And they sold off a bunch of U.S. Treasury bonds. And what that really did was it effectively depressed the price of the bond, which raised the yield rate. Bottom line is, it makes it more expensive for the U.S. government to borrow money moving forward, right?
On that topic, Rick, so, in China sold bonds, who do they sell them to? Do they sell them back to the United States? Do they sell them to other countries? Can they sell them to individuals? Or, because if they're selling them off, I'm just wondering who gets them in the long run then.
Yeah. An easy way to think about bonds is kind of like cars. You've got the brand new car coming off the assembly line, and then you've got the used car market, right? And so when the U.S. issues a bond, it's minting a brand new car, a brand new bond, and they sell it to the market, and it matures in 1, 2, 10, 30 years.
Right.
In that period of time, that bond can be sold on the open market to anybody that is willing to buy it. in a similar, so it's kind of like the used car market in that analogy. But much like the used car market, it doesn't exist in isolation. So if the used car market is starting to show signs of price instability, that impacts the new bond market as well. So when already issued bonds are generating a lower price, translating to a higher yield to the buyer, that means that the U.S. government, when it issues new bonds, has to compete against that, and they have to kind of respond in kind.
If you're just joining us, economics instructor Rick Reid is our guest. He's with Fox Valley Technical College, just talking about Econ 101, trying to break things down for those of us who are not economists. And we had talked about bonds the last time that you were on, because from what I understand, Rick, bonds were like the most solid of bets. Bonds were always a pretty solid bet, right? You are buying from the U.S. government. You are helping to fund the U.S. government by buying bonds. Is that accurate?
Correct. You're supplying the lendable funds to the government.
I'm loaning them money.
Right.
I'm loaning them money. But then when the interest went up, that was bad for the government, but good for me as the holder of the bond?
Exactly. Because the reality of part of what you're buying with a U.S. government bond is a very secure instrument. So far, knock on wood, the government's never failed to pay its debt to any of the bondholders, right? So from that perspective, you're basically getting a kind of a sure thing. When bond prices go down and the yield rate goes up, it's good for you as an investor. It's horrible for the government, because now they're effectively paying a higher interest on anything they need to borrow money for.
I guess the question, and I've asked this question to a lot of situations where we are investing in the government, whether it's our Social Security, our unemployment insurance. What happens if the government can't pay? Is it too bad, so sad? Or is it, I mean, do I have action to get my money because I bought in good faith from you and now you're saying you can't pay me? Is it you risk it with the bond even though it's so surefire, or is it something where I can come back and honestly, we have to go to break, so if you want to answer this on the other side of the break, because it's going to take a little bit longer. But
sure.
Rick Reid is here, an economics instructor from Fox Valley Technical College. We are going to continue with Econ 101 on the other side. Stay close. You are listening to Matenaer on Air on the Civic Media Radio Network. We'll be right back. Good morning. Welcome back to Matenaer on Air. Jane Matenaer, Greg Bach, and Dr. Slide on the board. Coming to you from our studio at Radio Park in Racine. Join us at 855-752-4842. You can leave a comment if you're watching on the live stream on Facebook, YouTube, and what used to be Twitter. And just a reminder, make sure you have the Civic Media app. Mm-hmm. Our statewide Scotty Summer Text to Win contest gets underway today. You have a bunch of chances to win. Listen in the 7, 11, 2 and 4 o'clock hours for that hour's keyword. Yep. You want to text in that word via the Civic Media app and be in the running for some fantastic prizes that could but probably won't change the course of your entire life. Download the Civic Media app and be ready. In the 11 o'clock hour, Tom Hartman will have the word for you to text in. Good luck.
We were talking to Rick Reid, who is an economic instructor at Fox Valley Technical College. And before we went to the break, I posed a question that I will sum up very quickly. If I, the investor, invest in U.S. bonds and the government can't pay yields on those, what is our recourse as individuals or anybody? Yeah,
basically sell the bond is what you would do, because the likelihood of them saying we're not going to pay, period. I don't think it'll be like a light switch where one day we can pay, the government can pay, and the next day it can't, with no news about that in advance. More likely, what would happen is that if the government was unable to pay, and really what we're talking about is not that it can't pay, but that it can't pay on time.
Right.
The reality of it is that would push the value of the bonds down pretty considerably, push the yields up pretty considerably. And I think what you'd see is a bunch of investors that are holding bonds trying to sell them very quickly. The likelihood of us going from where we are today to that scenario, it would take hopefully it would take years, maybe decades. I don't think you're going to see it happen overnight. What's more likely, though, is that we continue down the path of having an eroding credit rating as a nation. And if that continues to happen, and if the government, well, one of the things that happened, I think it was back in 2012, 2013, where the government basically was shut down. There was a group of congressmen that basically said, if we can't balance the budget, we're just not going to pass the bill. We're not going to pass a bill that doesn't balance the budget. Noble cause, a really bad way to do it. And the reason it's a bad way to do it is that it basically raised the question of the stability of the government and the ability to pay its bills on time. And that's going to have an impact on attractiveness of bonds to buyers. So
Cassandra on the live stream is essentially asking the same thing. If this House bill does not pass in the Senate, what happens then? Do we default on our debt, or is it just more likely that they're going to have to do another continuing resolution? Right,
they're going to have to continue to. We're going to patch this thing up as long as we can. Now, historically what we've had if you look over the last 10 years, we've had really low interest rates, right? Really low interest rates. And so that's enabled the government to be able to borrow money and not worry quite as much about balancing the budget urgently, right? Because the interest rate, if you're paying, 2%, it's a lot better than if you're paying 3, 4, 5%.
Sure.
That time is going to start to run out, and we're going to start to see the interest payments start to rise pretty quickly if we're not careful.
Well, and weren't our interest rates held not unnecessarily, but they were held low for a long time purposefully?
Right. Yeah, right. The Federal Reserve, in response to the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, one of the things that it did was it bloated its balance sheet. Basically, they made as much money, lendable money, available as possible. Right. Because one things that you don't want to have happen at the end of a recession, during a recession, or at the end of the recession, is having qualified borrowers not being able to access funds quickly and relatively inexpensively. You want them to be able to borrow the money to be able to invest to stimulate the economy.
Right.
The Federal Reserve kind of went overboard on that a little bit. They continued it on for quite a while, and they kept the rate
really low for a long time.
You bet.
Yeah.
This is why we have experts on, folks, because Jay and I, we are not experts. We're not lawyers, doctors, or economists. We are all those things adjacent.
Yes. That's why Rick Reid is here, an economic instructor from Fox Valley Technical College. We've got time for maybe one more question, Rick.
Yeah, Lori from Hayward asked the question, do you think that we should raise, do you think the Social Security cost of living adjustment should be raised this year?
Well, historically, it's raised based on the cost of living. They raise it based on the CPI from the prior year, and it's voted on by Congress to be able to enable it. So if you're receiving Social Security, you want it raised as much as possible. If you're not receiving Social Security, you're kind of, you don't really care much until you start, getting close to it. So should it or shouldn't it be? The standard practice has been that it's raised in accordance with the CPI.
There was an increase last year, I believe.
Okay.
I believe there was an increase in the cost of living last year. He is an economics instructor with the Fox Valley Technical College. We do Econ 101 with Rick Reid to try and break things down. Thank you so much. We really, really appreciate your time.
You bet. Thanks for having me on.